reach heaven's joys, O bright and sun. Heart of my heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler.
Hello, welcome back to our study in the book of Genesis, the great book of beginnings. You'll remember last time we were talking about Jacob. Of course, he had to leave home. He left home because of the deception that took place, how that he received the blessing when Esau really expected to receive it. Esau was very upset, ready to kill him, and so his mother talked to his dad, and God had arranged so that he could go and marry a daughter from among her own family. He made that journey, and as you'll recall, he met up with a beautiful young woman by the name of Rachel. He took the stone off the top of the well so that she could water her sheep, and he helped her do that. And then he ends up going to the home of Laban, who of course was the brother of his mother. And Laban, before very long, said, what do you want for wages as you live here with me? You shouldn't live here and work for free. And so Jacob knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted that beautiful young woman. And he agreed to work 7 years in order to win her hand. That's basically where we left off last time. Now, this time we want to observe what happens next. After the 7 years are over, naturally a wedding is about to take place. Listen to what it says, Genesis chapter 29, beginning at verse 20. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. What a marvelous, deep love that must have been. To be able to work 7 years and feel like it was just a very few days. Verse 21 then tells us that Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled that I may go into her." I've satisfied the 7 years, now I'm ready to be married. That's the way we would put it. Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. Now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Now wait a minute, what's this? Leah, his daughter, Leah's the oldest, but she's not the one that Jacob had labored these 7 years for. He labored for Rachel. She was his choice. But Laban now has effectively deceived the deceiver. Jacob has deceived his father on at least one occasion, deceived his brother in a certain sense of the word in getting him to sell the birthright, but now he himself is deceived. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me?" Well, now Jacob's come to that realization. Some people wonder, why is it that he didn't know the night before? We don't have all the answers to that question. It may be because it was dark. It may be because in the course of the wedding feast that he'd imbibed in a little bit of wine. I don't know what the reason is, but I do know that by morning he knows the deception and he's not happy at all about it. Laban said, "It must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn." Now that's an interesting piece of information. If that were true, why didn't Laban tell Jacob in the first place? I'm not sure that it is true. So far as I can tell, there's no history that would support this position, but it's what Laban told Jacob anyway, that he had to give his older daughter first, that's the way they did. So then in verse 27 he says, "Fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve me with me still another 7 years. Well, boy, Laban's making a bargain. We already showed that 7 years was exceptionally long to work and to give his labor in order to simply pay the bride's dowry. But now he's going to work another 7 years, 14 years for one woman. Now, what do you think he thought about that? Of course, if you've read the biblical story, you already know what he thought about that. Then Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. So he gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. And Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. Then Jacob also went in to Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served with Laban still another 7 years. So 2 wives instead of one. One wife that he didn't really love, and that's the sad part of this story. The favoritism that we saw played even within his own family growing up now becomes an issue, as it were, within his new family, because he really favors what has become his second wife, his first choice, but his second wife. And he favors her and doesn't really love her sister, and yet he's married to both of them. Verse 31 says, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, the Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. Well, this firstborn named Reuben, his name really means look, a son. And it may be that she believes that because she's had a son, that this is the firstborn of Jacob, that now she's going to be loved. Unfortunately, that's still not the case. Verse 33, then she conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Now, Simeon's name means heard. And notice how each of these names demonstrates the thing that she wants the most. She wants Jacob to recognize her as a wife that he loves. She wants Jacob to realize that God has heard her and has responded by blessing her with now 2 sons, the 2 firstborn sons of this great patriarch Jacob. She conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. Well, Levi's name means will be joined. And so you hear the words almost in what she says, attached. She's thinking that the birth now of 3 consecutive sons surely will cause her husband to be attached to her. Of course, that's not the case, but she's not done bearing sons. Verse 35 of Genesis 29 tells us, and she conceived again and bore a son and said, now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. Judah's name means will praise, not too surprisingly, because that's what she did. She praised the Lord for now having borne 4 sons to Jacob. The first 4 sons born to this patriarch were born from the womb of Leah, the unloved wife. In chapter 30, you can imagine what we're going to get into. Rachel now is concerned because she's not having any children. Listen to what she says. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children or else I die. Now, you and I might say, well, what has he got to do with it? And that's almost exactly the response that he gives. And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So she said, here is my maid Bilhah, go into her. and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her. Now this sounds very familiar. You remember that in the long ago, in this life story, that Abraham's wife Sarah gave him her handmaid. And her handmaid Hagar bore Abraham a son, Ishmael, but it was not the son of promise. And you remember the problems, the tension, as it were, that was in that household because of that decision. But Rachel's got to have a child. And so she follows that same course. You may recall that we said children that were born to a handmaid became the children of the mistress, that is, of her master's wife who had given her to him. And that's exactly what happens to him. So she said, here's my maid Bilhah, go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her. In other words, on my knees, I'm going to adopt her child. It's going to be my child. Then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged my case, and he also has heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. And you and I would not be surprised to know that Dan's name means he has judged. God has judged my case, and he's finally given me a child. And that she now feels somewhat fulfilled, and yet it doesn't really stop there. As you read on down in the text, notice this, and Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Well, what was this second son's name, you might ask? And the answer is in verse 8. Then Rachel said, with great wrestlings I've wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. Naphtali means my wrestling. And I've wondered and continue to wonder, what did all these young men think about their names when they came to realize the background of each of their names? I'm not sure I'd want to have the names that they had, given the meaning that comes with them. Nonetheless, this is what took place in the household of Jacob between his two wives and now one handmaid. But you know what? It didn't stop there, did it? It goes on from that place, sadly enough. And here's what we discover. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. Well, there's a competition going on here. Rachel said it when she said, I've wrestled with my sister. There's a competition here. They're vying for the attention of Jacob. And now she that is Leah, gives her maid Zilpah to Jacob, her husband, because she, that is Leah, can't bear any more children. And so she wants more children so that perhaps she can win the love of Jacob. So she gives Zilpah to Jacob. And guess what? Zilpah bore a son. Verse 11. Then Leah said, a troop comes. And she called his name Gad. A troop comes. And that means either good fortune or a troop comes. And when you think about it, a troop coming along to help would be good fortune. So in either case, the names carry similar ideas, and the meanings carry similar ideas within them. Then Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And how did Leah respond to that? Then Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. And Asher means happy. He's got probably the best name of all, happy. Of all these names, it's least indicative of what's going on in this battle. And yet, the battle is still there. There's division, there's turmoil in this house. And it will be a turmoil that will extend on down to the children, as we shall see a little bit later in our study. Well, you can imagine that Rachel's still not satisfied, especially not now, given the fact that her sister now has effectively, through herself and her maid, borne 6 sons to Jacob, and she's only had 2, and those are by her handmaid and not from her own womb. And so we discover a new thing occurring, beginning in verse 14. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." Well, there's a lot going on here, and to be honest with you, I don't know the story of the mandrakes, or I didn't, until I did a little bit of investigation. And here's what I discovered. Mandrakes really are a poisonous plant of the potato family. You've got to be very, very careful with these things. They are found, in this case, by Reuben during the time of wheat harvest. That means they're discovered along about in May. The mandrake root is sometimes called a love apple, or the roots are called love apples. The aroma of this plant is considered to be an aphrodisiac. I'm sure if you let that be known generally, that there's going to be a huge demand, at least momentarily, for the scent of mandrakes. Give me that mandrake perfume, some of the women are going to say. Aphrodite, interestingly enough, a Greek goddess, was known as the Lady of the Mandrakes. And this is because she, of course, is the goddess of love. And so I don't guess that would surprise us at all. In Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 13, we would notice that it is written, "The mandrakes give off a fragrance." And of course, that's a love song, a love poem. And again, we find a woman who wants to attract the attention of her man. And so this is what the background is behind all of this that's going on. Well, Rachel now has given away one night with their husband Jacob in order to get these mandrakes, thinking perhaps that they will cause her at last to bear a child. So in verse 16 in Genesis chapter 30, we discover when Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." And he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. It means my hire. And again, what a name to bear in life. But that's the name that this son is given, my hire. You're the object of a battle between sisters and within the family, and that will forever be with him. Wherever he goes, if he thinks about the meaning of his name, he'll know that story. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a 6th son. And Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Zebulun means honor, and that's what she's looking for. She's looking for Jacob to honor her as the preferable wife. And she thinks maybe now that she's born a half a dozen sons to Jacob, maybe now he will start to honor her. That at least is her desire. Afterward, she bore a daughter and called her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. Well, after 6 boys, then at last Leah bears a girl. And that girl's name is Dinah, which means judgment. And I'm not sure of the entire background of that. The text doesn't really tell us why it was that Leah named Dinah the name that she did, meaning judgment. But nonetheless, that is what took place. Now we've already heard God at last has heard the cries of Rachel to have a child, and He's going to answer. Verse 22, then God remembered Rachel. God listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. Well, Joseph is an interesting young man that she bears at this time. God has heard her. She bears a son, and her name for him is He Adds. And interestingly enough, Joseph's name means I'm looking forward to more just like him. That's the way you and I would put it. It means He adds. He's added one child to me, but it really looks forward to yet more children to come. So the struggle is still going on when you think about it. And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go. For you know my service, which I have done for you. Well, we now would guess, because of what we know, that he's been serving 14 years. And what's he gotten out of it? He's gotten 2 wives, 2 handmaids, who might be called concubines, and out of those relationships, he's had 6 sons and 1 daughter from Leah. He's had 2 sons from Bilhah, 2 sons from Zilpah, and 1 son has come from Rachel, his beloved wife. And so now we have 11 boys and 1 girl in the family of Jacob. And he's ready to go home after 14 years. Of course, Laban is not ready to give him up, and you can imagine why. And he will tell us why within the text. And Laban said to him, please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Yes, indeed. And in point of fact, we're not just going to see this in the life of Jacob. We'll see it also in the life of Joseph later. Because God loved Jacob, He blessed those who were associated with him. And don't you remember that that is precisely a part of the promise, Genesis chapter 12, that God made to Abraham? I will bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. So here he is. Laban has blessed him with these daughters and handmaids. And out of that has come these children, these 12 children, 11 boys, 1 girl. And so God has blessed Laban because of Jacob and His favoring and blessing Jacob. And so Laban doesn't want him to leave. So what does he say? Verse 28 of chapter 30 of Genesis. Then he said, name me your wages and I will give it. So Jacob said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. Now, when shall I also provide for my own house? So he said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Now think about it. What has he just said? You're not giving me anything, man. I'm working for you. And so all I'm doing is naming my wages. And when I work, you're going to pay me accordingly. And that's the message that he wants to deliver. He's establishing a proper view of this relationship that they're going to have. So verse 32, let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. For so my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of my wages comes before you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and the brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. That's as good as a branding iron, don't you think? Of course, these are not cows, they're sheep and goats. But we're going to be able to identify yours and mine very easily. If they're not speckled, spotted, or brown, they're yours. If they are speckled, spotted, or brown, then they are mine. That's the message that Jacob delivers, and that is the plan that he has for his wages. Well, how does Laban respond? Not surprisingly, he's in favor of it. Verse 34, and Laban said, "Oh, that it were according to your word." So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs. And he gave them into the hand of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So they're separating so that they can keep their flocks, their herds distinct from one another. And we'll see the importance of that later as we work our way along in this story. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and the chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs, where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. Now, he's got a plan going here. And his plan is that there'll be lots of animals that will be produced. He's going to have a bountiful harvest of animals. But it's not going to be just any animals. He's looking for the animals that satisfy his wages. And we'll see more in our next study together about what his plans are to make sure that he receives plenty of wages. Jacob is living out his life for the time being, his married life, there with his father-in-law, his mother's brother. And it is an interesting story indeed that leads and points toward the salvation of a nation.
May I reach heaven's joys, O bright and sun, heart of my heart, whatever befall, still be my vision.